father, who was actually raised Catholic, and my mother, who was raised Baptist, decided that they would kind of compromise on Catholic light, as it were, and go to the Episcopal Church. And by the way, this is an interesting little microcosm of the history of the U.S., which was early on predominantly Protestant. So you have the Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal, and Baptist Church, all the main churches right here on the four corners. And then later came the Catholics, and the Catholics stuck their church in the vacuum. By the way, my first marriage, I was married in that particular church, so I didn't have to travel very far. Anyway, so I was raised, first starting to be Baptist, and then essentially Episcopalian. At the age of about, I think it was 13 or 14, I was ultimately confirmed in the Episcopal Church, which is, you basically affirmed that you really believe this, and this is, your life is going to be as a Christian. Of course, but at the age of 13 to 14, you really don't know much. You're only starting to think critically a bit at that point, so I don't think it really counts for much. But what was important for me was my older brother, who's a year older than me, my brother Bill. Even as early as 7 or 8 years old, when we were in the choir at the Episcopal Church and so forth, started to express doubts about this stuff really isn't making sense. I don't, it wasn't just that we didn't want to go to church on Sunday morning, we'd rather watch cartoons. It's that somehow there was a disconnect. And what's interesting is, if psychologically, I understand now that even having one counter voice to all of the other opinions that are out there, because if you think about it, we were surrounded, especially at the time in the 1960s, the culture, our family, we were entirely surrounded by other Christians. So to have that one voice, every once in a while say, I don't think this makes sense, is really all it took for me to start having my own doubts. In fact, there's studies that are done. You could have a room full of people like this, and you could draw, like on a chalkboard, 2 lines that are obviously of different length. And they've done this test where they go around the room, and then the first person will say, are these the same length or different? And they're different. But they'll say, well, they're the same length. And you go, same length, same length, same length, same length. And it's all a setup because the last person in the room is the one being tested. And if they go all the way around, everybody says it's the same length, the last person in the room, more often than not, will say, well, I guess they're the same length. It's that peer pressure. So,
agree that it's the same length.
right. So, understanding that psychology of having that counter voice was very important to me. And I think it's still important in our society. And one reason, like humanists and free thinkers and so forth, are starting to grow because more people are kind of breaking that isolation and being able to come out and say there's another way of thinking about reality, essentially. Okay. Kind of to that same subject, this is a quote, I don't know who to attribute this to, was, few doubted the existence of God until philosophers tried to prove it. And I think there's some truth to that. Because in the Middle Ages, when you get into the Enlightenment period, is really when they started to say, some of this religious stuff doesn't really make sense. So the religionists, the theists, had to try to come up with ways to show that it was, logical. And that's where I think things started to go wrong, if you would, is really the birth of what's called apologetics. And what that means is not to apologize to somebody, but apologetics is simply the reasoned defense of a particular position. And it's typically used in the realm of religion. So a Christian apologist or a presuppositional apologist, which I'll get to, is one that tries to use reason to defend their particular position. Okay, so as I grew older, I went to engineering school, which I credit with giving me at least some sense of how to break down problems and think about them logically. It taught me not necessarily what to think, but how to think. And I think that's really important. So during my early youth, late teens into my 20s, I would have called myself an agnostic. I married a woman who was Catholic. I married in the Catholic Church. Our kids went to Catholic school. And I was really kind of ambivalent about the whole thing. So one day, actually it wasn't this book, I'll skip ahead, it was this book that I picked up when I decided, you know what, I really need to get off the fence. I need to find out what's, is there a God, is there not a God? Is what they're telling me correct or not? So I started reading pros and cons. I started reading C.S. Lewis, even some of the writings of Thomas Aquinas. And I also picked up George Smith's book, A Case Against God. And this book was probably the most influential for me because I saw in his very clear arguments, he talked about things like the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the teleological argument, which you may know today is, the teleological argument is known as the argument from design. The eye is so complex that it must have been designed, type of thing. Or the cosmological argument, which is the first cause argument, which says that, if everything has a cause, then there must be an initial first cause. That first cause is God. Anyway, he took on all of those classic arguments, and one by one he knocked them down. And as I read almost in one sitting, I read this book, and I said, this makes perfect sense to me. And the C.S. Lewis and the Thomas Aquinas did not make sense to me. So it's essentially helped me get off the fence and become the atheist I am today. Okay. Nope. Let me back up. Let me talk about Dan Barker just a second. Dan Barker is the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It was another very influential book that he wrote, Losing Faith in Faith, and where he talks about being an evangelical preacher and then gradually, it started out slowly, but then quickly over just a relatively few-week period, went through the very traumatic experience of essentially upending his entire worldview. And now he's, like I said, the co-president of the largest atheist organization in the country. So his book was another one that was influential kind of in my journey, knowing that it's possible to kind of move out of a theistic position to an atheistic position. All right, so that's just a little background of where I come from, why I think apologetics, both pro-theist and atheist, is really important. Personally, I think most people make decisions emotionally and then use reasoning to try to justify what they've already decided. Okay? For me, I think it was a little bit different. Maybe because I'm an engineer or a geek or whatever, that I looked at it a little bit differently. I wanted to use the reasoning part to make the decision and to try to keep the emotional part of it out of it as much as possible. So when I got the call from this gentleman up here, his name is John Speed. He is the pastor of Christ is King Baptist Church here in Syracuse. It was just over 2 years ago. I was already active in the atheist community. And John, it was an email actually, not a call, but John says, I got somebody coming in to do a presentation, and he would like also to do a debate that weekend. Now, for me, I jumped at the chance, and without even knowing who it was that was coming in, I said, sure, I'd be happy to do it. In fact, I had already done one debate on morality, and I think it was in this very room, actually, that I debated a guy from Syracuse. But anyway, I said yes, and then I said, oh, by the way, who am I debating? And he said, you're going to be debating Cy Ten Bruggencate, and he uses what's called presuppositional apologetics. And I said, what? What is that? So I had just over a month between the time I accepted and the debate. So the first thing I did was look him up on the internet and start listening to as much of what he had put out there as possible. Okay, so what is presuppositional apologetics? We already know what apologetics is. Presuppositional apologetics is pretty straightforward. Okay, this gentleman up here in the corner, Cornelius Van Til, he's a theologian from the Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. He's deceased now, but his writings from the 1950s, 60s, and even into the early 1970s kind of established presuppositionalism. And he described it as, quote, without the God of the Bible, the God of authority, the God that is self-contained and therefore incomprehensible to men, there would be no reason in anything. Okay? So the word presuppositionalism, basically what he's saying is we must presuppose, we must assume that it's true that a God exists, otherwise there would be no reasoning at all. Okay? So that's the foundational argument of what presuppositional is. I see a couple furrowed brows. Questions or clarifications?
What was the name again? His name?
His name is Cornelius Van Til. Good Dutch name. And like you'll find with a lot of presuppositionalists, they kind of follow a Dutch Reformed type of Calvinist Christian theology. Okay, so in order to make this argument, they're not talking about just the probability that a God exists. They want to show that it absolutely has to be the case that a God exists. They're making what's called a logically certain argument that God exists so that there's no possibility that they could be wrong. Okay? In order to do that, you need to make what's called a deductive argument. Now, I don't want to get too deep into philosophy 101 here, but a deductive argument is pretty straightforward. If it's structured properly and the premises are true, then the conclusion has to follow. Okay? So this is a classic deductive argument. Premise number one, all men are mortal. Premise number two, Socrates is a man, and we can conclude by putting these together that Socrates is mortal. This is both what they call valid, that is, the structure of the argument is proper, and sound, deductive argument, because the premises are in fact true. Okay? So the conclusion must necessarily follow. Okay? Now, the philosopher Immanuel Kant called this synthetic argument. In other words, what we're doing is we're synthesizing two different points. One is on the subject of men being mortal, and the second is Socrates being a man. So all we're doing is synthesizing those two together to connect them, to come up with new information. The new information, Socrates is mortal. Okay? With me so far? Okay. Now, why is this important? Because what you're going to see is the presuppositional argument, the deductive argument that they use is rational thought is impossible without God. Premise number two is rational thought is possible. Therefore, the conclusion is God exists. Okay? Now, this is actually a valid argument, meaning that the structure is correct. The problem is it's not sound. And the reason it's not sound is because they do a thing, it's called a circular argument. Because what they're doing is they're assuming God, which is the same thing that they're trying to conclude. So it's the same thing when they refer to the Bible, for example. So why is presuppositionalism true? They'll say, because it says so in the Bible. Well, how do we know that the Bible is? Well, it's because God says it. Well, how do we know that God is not lying? Because it says so in the Bible. It just goes round and round and round. It's a circular argument. Now, Immanuel Kant would call this an analytic or an analogical argument because all we're doing is essentially equating one thing with another. We're not actually creating any new information in this particular case. So that's the first problem with their argument, is that it's not a sound deductive argument. So the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the premises. Okay. Now, the other big issue we have with this particular argument was actually exposed by a gentleman by the name of Brian Boss. Okay? And this is, I'll have to talk a little bit about inductive arguments versus the deductive arguments that we've already talked about. What Brian Boss has shown is that embedded in the presuppositional argument, specifically the first premise, rational thought is impossible without God, embedded in there is an inductive argument. And what an inductive argument is basically you take individual instances and you draw a broader conclusion, okay? An example of an inductive argument, okay? The sun rose yesterday in the east, rose in the east again this morning. The conclusion is the sun will rise in the east every day, okay? So we're taking particular instances of the sun rising in the east, and we're concluding the general principle, the sun will rise in the east. Another one might be if we see a white swan, and then we, through our whole lives, we see white swan after white swan, we may conclude that all swans are white, okay? Now that would be a reasonable inductive conclusion. Well, it turns out that not all swans are white. So an inductive argument doesn't have the same, even constructed properly, doesn't have the same absolute certainty that a deductive argument is. And that's the problem that Brian Boss exposed, was what, in his paper, he points out what the presuppositionalist is doing, and I'll go back to this, that rational thought is impossible without God. But the presuppositionalists, even if they were absolutely correct in their argument, they could only make an inductive argument that everybody else was wrong. And what they do is they look at what they call worldviews. They say there was the Christian worldview, and then there's the atheist worldview. And they say, well, the atheist worldview is wrong, so far it's impossible to have rational thought. Therefore, the Christian worldview is right. The problem with that is there's more than just one worldview. Even if they were correct, which they're not, that the quote-unquote atheist worldview is wrong, there are other worldviews. There's the Hindus, for example, who believe that everything is an illusion. And there's other types of view, and I wouldn't even call atheism a worldview, but I won't get into that. So what they're trying to argue is that everything is wrong. All swans are white, essentially, when they have no mechanism to examine all worldviews or all potential future worldviews. So the problem is they're making an inductive argument embedded in their deductive argument. So when it gets to the end, to the conclusion, they can't have the absolute certainty that they argue for. Does that make sense? All right. So that's the problem with inductive argument. Now, presuppositionalists know that they have a problem with their argument. Okay? Now, whether they acknowledge it or not is a different thing. More often than not, they won't. So what do you do when you have a bad argument? Well, you practice certain avoidance techniques, okay? And this is exactly what we run up against when we actually try to debate presuppositionalists, and what I encountered with Zai, both my debate and then I also had to sit down and chat with him at the Unitarian Church. Two of the most common types of avoidance techniques are what we call a strawman and reversing. A straw man, here's an example of a straw man. And this is something commonly you would hear from a presuppositionalist or other theistic apologists. If we're all just evolved chemical reactions, how do you get to, quote, this is true, unquote? Okay? Now, why is this a straw man? Well, because I'll get into truth a little bit later on, but no one is saying that just chemical reactions are true or not true, okay? And again, I'll get into more detail on that later. The other problem with this is it commits what's called the fallacy of composition. Now, what the fallacy of composition is, maybe the best way to illustrate it is, come on in, you're all right. Don't worry.
Thank you.
We're all family. The fallacy of composition, you can think of it in terms of a jet airplane, okay? A jet airplane can fly across the ocean, let's say, all right? But the jet airplane is just made up of parts. The engine alone can't fly across the ocean. The fuel tank can't. The passenger seats can't. But if you put this all together, now it has the ability to fly across the oceans. So what they're saying, and why this is a distraction, is if we're just evolved chemical reactions, if we as human beings are just chemical reactions. Well, it's true that we're composed of chemical reactions, but we're not just chemical reactions. We have unique attributes when all of those things come together. So they're committing the fallacy of composition by equating the individual capacity, the attributes of individual components to the thing as a whole. And that's a huge mistake, and you'll see it over and over again. Okay. The other avoidance technique that you'll see very often is called reversing. Now, I've taken some sales training, and this is sales 101. Somebody asks you a question. What you do is you turn it around. And here's a perfect example. What does the Bible say about, you can ask the presuppositionalist anything about the Bible. Now, if it was Saitam Rugenkate, he's more abrupt about it. He would say, well, I don't do Bible study with atheists or non-Christians or whatever. But a more tactful apologist might say, well, I'll be happy to answer that question, but let's focus on this instead. So if you ask me any question, like what I had for breakfast, I might say, well, that's a very interesting question. Why do you ask? And what I've done is I completely turned it back. Now I don't have to answer the question. Okay? So it's a very common technique called reversing. And now you know about it. You'll probably see it more often in debates and so forth. Okay. So let me get back to the idea of certainty that I mentioned, that embedded in the presuppositional argument is the idea of absolute certainty. Okay? They've created the circular argument in order to try to kind of avoid the issues that come with that. They will claim an absolute certainty. There's no possibility they could be wrong that this God exists. And Greg Bonson, who's he's deceased now, but he was a student of Van Til, he says Scripture does not present, nor do we worship, a probability, as to kind of underscore the absolute certainty and conviction. Well, it's more than conviction, because there's a difference between what I call psychological certainty or conviction and logical certainty. And what psychological certainty is, just you have a lot of evidence. Like gravity is always an attractive force, okay? So if I get up in the morning, I'm going to expect I'm not going to fly off the floor. I have a lot of conviction that tomorrow morning when I go to bed, I'm not going to be stuck to the ceiling, okay? But that's different than a logical certainty. A logical certainty is essentially an absolute in which it can be no other way, okay? Now, to kind of underscore this idea of certainty, there's a story, I'll just tell quickly the story that actually Saitam Rugenkate uses this story in his lectures that he gives to his Christian audiences. And he tells this story in an attempt to try to show that how they can use this technique on non-believers, and non-believers are so stubborn, they're so stuck in their ways, they absolutely will not listen to this argument no matter what. And it's called the dead man story, and it goes something like this. Right? His family had a relative that was convinced he was dead. Okay, and they try to talk him out of it. You know, Harold, you're not dead. Yes, I am dead. Well, you know, there's no way you can't be dead. You're moving, and so I'm dead. I'm telling you, I'm dead. When exasperation, they took him to the doctor, and they asked the doctor, says, you know, Harold's convinced he's dead. We really need to talk him out of this. And the doctor thought for a moment and says, okay, well, come here, Harold. And he takes Harold's finger and he pokes it. And before anything happens, he looks at Harold and says, now, Harold, do dead men bleed? And Harold says, well, no. And then he shows him his finger, and there's blood coming out of the tip of his finger. And he says, there, Harold, see, you're not dead. And Harold says, well, what do you know? Dead men do bleed. So the irony is that you can show a presuppositionalist all the logical fallacies that they're employing, how absolutely wrong they are in this thing, but they're stuck in this mindset where they can't escape.
But they claim the same to the atheists.
They claim the same to the atheists. So what do we have to go on? Well, we have our ability to think and to use logic to determine which position is more rational. Okay? What the presuppositionalist is trying to do is to say, in order to have that position, there has to be a God to begin with. And that kind of gets into the whole, what we call the tag argument, transcendental argument for God. I don't go into detail in this talk, but we can talk about that if you want. But that's really essentially nonsense. We're all starting from the same position, what I call the same axioms, the foundational starting point to be able to know anything. Okay, so what is it that the presuppositionalist is certain about? What is their God that they're absolutely convinced is there, and they're trying to convince everybody else actually exists? Well, if you ask them, they'll say it's the Christian God of the Bible. And the Christian God of the Bible is, among other things, omnipotent, omniscient, Trinitarian, and so forth. Okay? Now, I won't go into each one. I go into more detail in the book about why these are essentially nonsensical attributes. Just very quickly on omnipotent, for example. An omnipotent being would be all-powerful, could do anything. There's no limits to what could be done. But if you ask, for example, Uzziah, beat up on him a little bit, if you ask him, well, how do you know that what your God is revealing to you, or you're reading the Bible, you're not being intentionally deceived? Well, God can't lie. How does he know this? Because it says in the Bible, God can't lie. Well, how is it that God could be omnipotent and do everything if you're now saying that he can't lie? So what they do is they say, well, omnipotence, lying is not a constituent of omnipotence. So I'm going to exclude being able to lie from the category of being omnipotent. And what you ultimately get down to is that God can do anything that's in his nature, essentially, is the argument. And of course, Sai and other presuppositionalists, other Christians will define what God's nature is. Of course, that doesn't work either. As I pointed out to Sai in my discussion with him, I said, well, my dog could be omnipotent under that definition, because my dog can do everything that's in the nature of a dog to do. Okay? Can he go make me a cup of tea? No. But that's not in his nature, so he's still omnipotent. So it ends up being foolish. All right. The way that presuppositionalists work, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of in the deductive argument. It's a two-track or two-pronged attack, if you would. One is to try to show that the non-believer cannot have a basis for rationality, and the other is to show that their God is somehow the foundation. Now, I think I've shown that their God is not the foundation. That doesn't make any sense. So they focus mostly on trying to show that non-believers, non-Christians, can't know anything. And it starts with, how do you know? You'll hear this over and over. You're actually nauseated by how much you hear it. How do you know? How do you know? So they'll ask you, what's the speed limit on the street outside? Well, let's say it's 30 miles an hour. They'll ask, well, how do you know? Well, I saw the street sign. Well, how do you know that you saw it correctly? Well, because I'm functioning properly in the world. Well, how do you know you're actually functioning in the world? How do you know that you're not, as Sai asked me, face down in the psych ward somewhere just hallucinating? What that gets down to is what Ludwig von Wittgenstein he'll call it bedrock, okay? And the way he says, if I've exhausted the justifications, I have reached bedrock, and my spade is turned, then I'm inclined to say this is simply what I do. So what he's saying is, I'll give you an example, the street sign example, is if I look at the street sign, my justification for saying it's 30 miles an hour is actually seeing the letters, or the numbers, on the street sign, okay? But now how do I know my senses are giving me valid information? Well, that's the point where essentially I've hit bedrock. I can't use my senses, which is the only way I interact with the world, to validate my senses. That would be the circular argument that the presuppositionalists use. So we get to a point where we can no longer further justify it. And I make the point, and if you watch my videos online, especially my talk with Sai, he keeps asking, how do you know, how do you know, how do you know? You get to the point where you get to the bedrock where it's simply not knowledge. You must assume these things to be true. And among them are, for example, that you exist. Whether it's in physical form or whether it's consciousness, there has to be some existence. Because the opposite of I exist, for example, is I do not exist. But just to say I don't exist assumes that you exist, so that you get into a contradiction. Same thing with your senses. You must assume that you're interacting with some reality external to yourself. If you don't at least assume that, then you can get absolutely nowhere. So that's the bedrock that he's talking about. Now, the reason they do this, the reason that the presuppositionalists will hound so much and try to break the non-believer down and undermine the idea that they can know anything, is they want to try to sneak the whole concept of God, and I call it the Trojan horse approach. If you take what they say at face value, that there must be something at bottom that essentially justifies your existence, your sense of being valid, and so forth, which they'll posit as God. If you accept that, then they want to essentially roll in through the gates this broader concept. They don't show it as a broader concept, but you're going to get a few goodies inside the Trojan horse that you may not bargain for, like the Trinitarian nature of their specific Christian God, or the fact that we had a son that died on the cross. All that extra stuff, which isn't necessary to the argument, comes in through the Trojan horse. So in that sense, it can be very deceptive. Okay, I mentioned the axioms, and really the fundamental difference between ourselves, myself as a non-believer and a presuppositionalist or a Christian, is what they consider foundational. What's the bedrock? And I mentioned I exist, our sense perception, the laws of logic. Something cannot be something and something else at the same time in the same way. I mean, those are things that we have to accept that are not further justified. But what the presuppositionalist does is essentially, although they don't use the term axiom, their presupposition is, in a sense, an axiom in which they're saying God exists. The problem is, if you look at these two lists, the I exist, sense perception, laws of logic. Now, why do I say those are axiomatic? Well, one is they can't be further justified. And one way you know whether they can't be further justified or not is if the opposite of those is incoherent. All right? So like I said, I do not exist. That very statement is incoherent, okay? Because it has a contradiction embedded in it. If you didn't have sense perception, well, how would you know you didn't have sense perception unless you could perceive it somehow? All right, another contradiction, so the opposite is incoherent. Excuse me. But contrast that to the axioms that the presuppositionalist is proposing, that God exists along with the specific attributes of that God, the omnipotence, Trinitarianness, all-loving, and so forth. But the question is it possible that there is a God that's not omnipotent? Is that a coherent concept? Sure. So, that's not foundational. Since you have an option between omnipotent and non-omnipotent, there must be a reason, there must be a justification, in other words, for why you would choose or say that this particular God is omnipotent. In other words, you need a justification for it. You're not at bedrock yet, despite the fact that they're claiming that God exists is the bedrock. Same thing with, is it possible that God is quadratarian, for example, instead of Trinitarian? Of course, that's a completely coherent concept. Okay? Loving and so forth. So that's one of the major issues is, in effect, what the presuppositionalist is doing is borrowing, if you would, the non-theistic worldview, or at least the axioms, to come up with their list of God attributes. That make sense? That's a really important point. Okay. There's a couple of the specific arguments that they'll use to try to kind of buoy up their their argumentation. One's called the uniformity of nature argument. Jason Lyle, who's actually an astrophysicist and a young Earth creationist, believe it or not, he said, quote, "The biblical creationist expects there to be order in the universe because God made all things and has imposed order on the universe." The key word here is imposed, okay? Now, most people don't think about this, but what would it mean for the universe to not have order? Okay, let's say gravity, for example. If I drop my clicker here, over and over and over again, I'm going to expect gravity to pull it down, right? Well, what would it mean, and that consistency is what they're talking about in uniformity. What would it mean if we just talk about gravity, we forget about all the other forces in nature, the strong force and weak force and the nucleus and radiation and everything else? What would it mean to say that gravity was non-uniform? Well, that means it could be infinitely attractive, which means everything would be crushed, or infinitely repulsive, which means nothing would have formed to begin with. For no reason, for any duration of time, it just becomes completely incoherent. Basically, the whole idea of cause and effect ends up breaking down. So the idea that there can be non-uniformity ends up breaking down. Okay? So uniformity ends up being one of those axioms because the opposite, non-uniformity, ends up being an incoherent concept. All right? But what implied in this message is that the natural state is non-uniform and somehow God is required to make everything work properly. That make sense? Okay. The other thing they're doing is a couple of fallacies here. One is called the fallacy of the stolen concept, otherwise known as special pleading. What they're doing is assuming that God is uniform in his ability to impose uniformity on the universe. Well, how do they get to assume that God is uniform without assuming that the universe is uniform? That's called special pleading. They're saying, well, God is a special case. It doesn't count. Well, there has to be a reason for that. Okay. The other issue is that miracles. Miracles is a direct violation of the uniformity of nature. So very often you'll hear that description of miracle is an event which cannot be explicated by known natural principles. Okay? Which is, you may recognize, that's just the argument from ignorance, which is to say, we don't know why something happened. We don't know why lightning strikes. So we're going to say God did it and it's a miracle. Okay? But you'll also hear them say that God has promised to impose this uniformity generally, general uniformity, but that the miracles are the exception to that. Of course, we wouldn't be able to do any science if there were exceptions to the uniformity of nature, because we would never know whether the results of our experiment were just God tinkering with the lab equipment, or whether it was something fundamental that we discovered. So the whole idea of miracles also undermines the whole premise. All right, I mentioned I'd get into truth just a little bit. There is an anecdote or an argument, I guess, attributed to Douglas Wilson, who was an apologist. And it goes something like this. If we're just evolved chemical reactions, which I mentioned before, we're just called evolved chemical reactions. That would be like shaking up a bottle of Dr. Pepper on one side and a bottle of Mountain Dew on the other side, and letting them fizz and trying to determine which one was true. Okay? Now, if that sounds crazy, it is, because it is crazy. The problem with that whole story, there's a couple of problems with that story. One of which is that, we're not getting too technical, what truth is it's a two-subject relational predicate, to be exact. But truth is that which corresponds with reality. And the two subjects are, and I'll give you an example. Snow is white, okay? Snow and white. And we're putting the two together. Snow is white. we can say that's true or false. Okay, that's a proposition in which we can make the judgment of whether it's true or false. Okay, so we're comparing two things. But just to say that one is fizzing, is fizzing true, well, we're not comparing anything. So his story is completely incoherent because he gets the whole idea of truth wrong to begin with. Okay, and of course it gets into the whole fizzing if we're just chemical reactions, the whole fallacy of composition. Okay. Free will is another issue. Again, because most presuppositionalists are Calvinists, they have kind of an interesting view of free will, and they get themselves in a bit of a trap because, of course, God has dominion over everything. So how is it that we have free will if God is in charge of everything? That's a contradiction. But as incoherent as that is, I heard, and this is again from, I'll let you guess who this is from, but this is even more dangerous, I think. Go from essentially absurd to the dangerous here. And asking what was the first sin in the Garden of Eden? Now, most people would say, well, eating of the apple was the first sin, being disobedient to God. Well, in this particular instance, they don't say that being disobedient was the sin. They say acting autonomously to choose and think for oneself was the sin. Anybody know who said this, by the way? It was my old friend, Saitem Ruby, said this. And again, in a lecture to, I may have been to the folks at the local Syracuse church. So what he's saying is to think, to choose and think for yourself is a sin. And when I heard that, I thought to myself, so he's making an argument to try to convince us that he's right. Yet we wouldn't be able to accept his argument because to do so would have to choose his argument and think it was actually valid, which in his book would be a sin. So I think this gets very, like I said, dangerous. It's really kind of mind-numbing, thought-stopping type of thinking. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here. There's a lot more to cover, but I'm going to let you ask me questions, and we'll cover what you guys want to cover. I'm just going to quote Spinoza here, which I think he's about 300 years ago when he lived. I think he was well ahead of his time when he said, the supreme mystery of despotism, its prop and stay, is to keep men in a state of deception, and with the specious title of religion, to cloak the fear by which they must be held in check, so that they will fight for their servitude as if for salvation, which I thought was a very interesting quote. Because I think, in the end, what presuppositionalism is really a deception. It's a sleight of hand in which they're trying to undermine our own ability to be able to think and reason and come to conclusions and sneak in, again with the Trojan horse deception, their idea of God. And it's, for a lot of people, it's become kind of the go-to argument, again for reasons of certainty. There's a certain psychological desire, to put it that way, to have certainty. In fact, just to close out, let me read a quote out of my book that talks about that very desire for certainty and why I think it's important to resist it. A gentleman by the name of David Gall from Northwestern University, is a researcher, and they concluded, he said, people whose confidence in closely held beliefs was undermined engaged in more advocacy of their beliefs than people whose confidence was not undermined. They also concluded that those most vocal evangelists for a belief may be, quote, boiling over with doubt. So in one sense, they're trying to hide their doubt by being more vocal about what they're doing. Another one, interestingly, Dr. David Rock, executive director of the Neuro Leadership Institute, explains that after basic survival, one of the brain's main motivators is, quote, the need for certainty. It turns out your brain craves certainty in a similar way and using similar circuits for how we crave food, sex, and other primary rewards. Information is rewarding, unquote. So I think that one of the things that the presuppositionalists and a lot of apologists peddle is this idea of being absolutely certain. You don't have to think about it. There doesn't have to be any nagging doubts. And in that sense, they have kind of a psychological advantage over skeptics like myself, who say, you know, we really should have a healthy dose of skepticism and doubt about even those things that we are have a lot of conviction about, because it's possible that we could be wrong.
So you're saying, in that quote, when you say information is good for the brain, but even though it's wrong, you're saying it's
Right.
good even though it's wrong?
Right.
That
So
doesn't matter.
exactly. So psychologically, emotionally, what we're craving is certainty, even if we're wrong. So there's a certain emotional reward to feeling like you've got it figured out.
Hence the creation of religion and the priesthood, right? People say, I have an answer.
Right.
I have certainty for you.
Exactly. What, you know, like the ultimate question of what happens after death.
Right?
Well, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Yeah, we've got it figured out, and you don't have to have the distress of being down in.